Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another episode of that wasn't a very good start, Kevin. That's the first time, JB, that I've ever started and not been on my game. So, hey, everybody, welcome everybody to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Today, we're live. Leaders today can learn from leaders in the past. That's a belief I share with our guest today. While situations and contexts change, human nature doesn't. With an eye to the past, we look forward to be better leaders. Welcome to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast live. Today, our guest, I'll tell you about him in a second, is going to help us think about the past, the present, and the future. And we are live today. So while this episode will later be on the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, right now we're live. And so if you're here and you want to be in the know as a podcast listener later on, you could get involved now by joining our Facebook or LinkedIn groups so that you can get involved when we have future live sessions and be a couple of months ahead of when these come out on the podcast. You can join us on remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook, remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn. Either one will get you that access. And with that, let me tell you about our guest today. Our guest today is Jan-Benedict Steenkamp. He is a Massey Distinguished Professor of Marketing at the University of North Carolina and a member of the selection committee of the Spinoza Prize, nicknamed the Dutch Nobel Prize. He is the co-founder and executive director of AMARC and a Global Strategy and Branding Institute. A prolific writer, he's the author of 5 business books, including the brand new one right here. We're going to talk about it today, Time to Lead. His books have been translated into 7 languages. I think you're one ahead of me, JB. He has taught, consulted, and given executive seminars on all continents and to a multitude of organizations, including the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. His work has been featured in the Harvard Business Review, the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, Economist, New York Times, and in newspapers and television around the world, including today, the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. He's received an honorary doctorate, a lifetime achievement honors from the Royal Netherlands Academy of Sciences, the American Marketing Association, and the European Marketing Academy. JB, welcome. Glad to have you.
It's wonderful to be on your show, Kevin.
Well, so he said I could call him JB, so that's what I'm going to do because I kind of like the way that sounds.
Yeah.
Okay. So you're a marketing guy, and now you're writing a book on leadership. You've had an interesting journey. Just tell us very quickly a little bit about the journey that leads you to here. What got you from the Netherlands to here and to doing the work that you're doing today?
Indeed, as you can say, my accent is not an American accent, but it's a Dutch accent. You don't lose it if you move to the United States at a later age. And I moved there in 2006, and I became a citizen in 2016. And in 2006, I was ready, for a new challenge, and I was looking around, and the University of North Carolina made me an offer I could not refuse. On top of it, the weather here, in North Carolina I'm talking about, is a lot better than in the Netherlands, where it is usually dreary, it is not hot, and it is raining. And these kind of things, it is just in terms of living here is great, and the university is great as well.
Awesome. So this book is called A Time to Lead. Your other 4 books are really in the areas of marketing and branding. So, there's a number of things. I get books all the time of people that want to be on the show, and you've got a tremendous variety of folks that have endorsed the book. You've got a true leader from the U.S. military in the foreword of the book. And so how did all of that come about, especially when you're really a, quote, marketing guy?
Yes, well, I'm a marketing guy, but my passion actually is not marketing. That has been history. So long before I knew anything about history, about marketing, I was already reading a lot about history. So that is one element. A second element is that over the years, actually already from my undergraduate student years on, I've had a lot of leadership positions. So it is, you could think, hey, I'm a marketing academic, but most people, they have also a lot of leadership positions there. So you learn a lot from those things as well. And then a third element is there are a lot of commonalities between leadership and marketing, in the sense that at the core is leadership. You want to get your followers, if you will, want to get others to follow you, and you can use a lot of different strategies to do that, from persuasive to charismatic, if you will. Now, those same elements you also find in branding strategy, which is within the marketing my area of expertise. So in this book, actually, in a number of places, I look at some leadership, like, for example, the leadership of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, actually also from a marketing point of view, that he used a number of marketing principles without knowing it, because he was intuitively just a genius. But we can better understand leadership by also looking at it, bringing in some marketing elements in there. So it's the combination, history, leadership as a practitioner of leadership in a lot of different positions in different organizations, and marketing, that I bring together in this book.
So it's interesting that you say that. And I was thinking about that as I was reading the book. I haven't read all of it yet, but I've read a lot of it. And I was thinking about that exact same connection. And I was thinking about the fact that we had Seth Godin on as a guest here. And we talked about that same intersection of marketing and in leadership. So we'll make sure we put in the show notes, or people can go find my conversation with Seth.
So also, by the way, Kevin, is now that a lot of the newest, the best insights come where actually two different disciplines kind of overlap. Think about biochemistry or astrophysics or some of those other things. So that is well known, that actually that very fruitful insights come to the fore when people combine two disciplines. It's an intersection. Now, of course, I'm not going to compare myself with an astrophysicist. For one thing, I'm a little bit more practical. But the point is, yes, I do believe that you can actually fruitfully understand an area by bringing in a perspective from another area.
Yeah, it's the same. It's an excellent point, and so I'm excited. And that's actually one of the reasons why I even asked the question, because the book stands on its own. We wouldn't need to have had to talk about the marketing component. And unbeknownst to you, I'm hoping we get the chance to talk a little bit about the Roosevelt chapter before we're done. But before we get there, you make an assertion. I made it in the very opening here that is, I believe, true, and I know that you believe is true. And it's this idea that we can learn from leaders of the past, even in the case of the book, from the far past. So not everyone would agree with this, because here's the opposing viewpoint. Right. The opposing viewpoint is, listen, the world is so different now. We should be looking at leaders today, not leaders way back. They didn't have the internet. They didn't have, well, we could go right on down the line. Why is it that you believe that we can learn from leaders in the past?
I could talk for ages about this, but the thing is, yes, we didn't have the people in the past didn't have the internet. We have other examples where, for example, Roosevelt was one of the first to use that new medium of its time. That was the radio. Now, another example is, not everything is different, because ultimately leadership, the component in leadership is you're dealing with humans. We are not talking about a dictatorship where everybody that says is gonna be shot. No, we are talking about getting humans to agree with you. Now, whether it is the internet or it is the sailing ship, humans don't change that much. So yes, some of the means may be different. Of course, President Trump uses Twitter, Roosevelt uses the radio. Well, that's a little different from each other. The principles are not that different. And let's look at it from another point. Let's look at how there is so much evidence how some of the greatest of our leaders were deeply inspired by previous leaders. Let's take one of the greatest American leaders, is Dr. Martin Luther King. He was very clear about that. He was very strongly affected by what he did and in his tactics by what Mahatma Gandhi did some decades before in India. Later on, a president that we still know we're old enough to remember King, but much more recent, President Mandela of South Africa, one of the most monumental leaders of the 20th century. Mandela was very clear. He studied King's life to help him to do what he is going to do. Now let's put as follows. If people of the ilk of Mandela and King felt that they could learn from leaders in the past, now in 2020, we believe these guys get it all wrong. We can learn nothing from them. Honestly, I don't think that is the case. Plus, let's face it, a number of the so-called great leaders of recent life. Think about Jack Welch of GE. I mean, GE is close to complete collapse. Let's look at Zuckerberg. I mean, if he isn't in one problem, he's in the next problem when it comes to dealing with all the kind of issues. And his interviews, his interrogation for the European Parliament, for Congress, were just terrible. Or Carlos Ghosn, the hallowed leader of Nissan, Renault, Mitsubishi, was on its road to become the biggest car company in the world, and actually it's completely collapsed. So actually sometimes it is good to take a perspective of people that have been tried. And I'm not the only one who says that. The Economist, and there can be hardly any source that is more authoritative than the Economist, wrote an article not so long ago in which they brought that perspective, and they even said, bosses should read more history books. And I think these are just a couple of elements where I do believe that, yes, we can learn from the past, or as the French say, l'histoire se répète. History repeats itself. And in my book, I am not literally saying, okay, it is going to be literally like that, but I use those insights to identify, okay, what does that mean for us now?
So the book lays, and I agree with you, and 100% across all that. There's others examples of that in the book in terms of leaders that we would recognize looking back. Those, of course, being among the most prevalent and obvious. So there's a theme that runs through the book, and in fact, the book is framed around 7 leadership styles. So we don't have time, obviously, JB, to dive into all of them deeply, but can you just give us the overview of the 7, and then I want to ask you some questions about it.
Yeah. So just very briefly. So these 7 leadership styles, those cover the most common and most pertinent ways how leaders can essentially get others to follow them. First point is adaptive leadership. Essentially, here the leader will modify their views and even their behaviors according to the circumstances. So there it is not so much that you try to get the followers to change. You yourself change because you recognize that you are running into problems that you cannot overcome. Persuasive leadership is the other side. That is where you consciously set about to change the opinion of your followers. And FDR is one of the greatest in that one. Directive leadership, that is more, let's say, the command and control leadership. And that is essentially you set out the marching orders and others follow you. Margaret Thatcher was humongously successful with that. Disruptive leadership is a different one. Essentially, what you do is you break with the past. You essentially disrupt the organization, you or the country, and you move into a completely different direction. Authentic leadership is a fourth one, and that is where you lead by example. It is your personal example and your integrity, like President Mandela that I mentioned earlier is one of these examples, that he was able to get people to follow him because they really felt that he was a man of the utmost integrity. Servant leadership is a very interesting kind of leadership. It's kind of popular, but it is there you put your followers and their interest first, not your own interest or even the organization's interest, but the interest of your followers. And then the final one is charismatic leadership. That's also an interesting one. In principle, what you have there is that perhaps the people don't really believe so much in what you want to do, but they believe in you. And they believe so much in you that because of their belief in you, they're willing to follow you. Alexander the Great is the most charismatic leader in world history, and he's a great example. So these are the 7 leadership styles.
Okay, so I'm sure as people are listening to the 7, they're saying, "Well, that sounds good." Like I've talked with thousands of leaders, and they talk about, well, we ought to lead by example, and we ought to be persuasive, and well, maybe the charismatic one is a little different. Some people feel like you either got that one or you don't. But as a general statement, as we listen to you say all those, we're probably all saying, well, yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense, right? So my question is this: is there one that's most relevant today from your perspective?
The answer to that is no. As I document in the book, and it's my firm conviction that there is not one leadership style that is more relevant today. What is clear is that, and these historic examples show it, and I could also put present leaders on that line, political leaders, etc., is that you can be highly successful in using any of these leadership styles. You can also really kind of bomb out using any of these leadership styles. Those are essentially the ineffective leaders. But what you have, for example, let's say what you find, the gurus are these days mostly selling servant leadership. That is, you are the servant of your followers, and it is the interest of the followers that are really pertinent. Now, for some people, that is a great way to lead because it fits with their personality. But for other people, not. Let's put it as follows. I think, it's not a political statement. President Trump, even if he would want to be a servant leader, which honestly I don't think he wants to be, he can be because it doesn't match with him. So the point is, as General Holt makes very clear in his foreword, is that he says there is not one best leadership style, but there is one thing that is very clear: you cannot be the leader that you are not. So, for example, you cannot be a directive leader if you don't have certain character traits. But you also, a charismatic leader requires certain qualities. So do not try to be the leader that is the latest fad. And those fads are usually, after a couple of years, they have completely forgotten. Try to be the leader and try to follow more the leadership style. And you can have a combination of styles in the book that is closest to the kind of person that you are. And as General Holt says, is that, yes, okay, then you can learn from these examples to further improve your leadership. Because, of course, none of us is born with innate leadership styles. We learn by learning from our parents, by watching, etc. And as your career moves, so you learn. But you cannot become the leader that you are not. And that is what the gurus try to sell you. And that most of it is, as General Holt says, and I would like to quote him on that because I agree, is hogwash.
Well, and so, we're talking with Jan-Benedict Steenkamp, the author of the new book, Time to Lead, Lessons for Today's Leaders from Bold Decisions That Changed History. So is it a history book? Is it a leadership book? The answer is yes, it is both. And I think that that's one of the things that I find most interesting about the book is that, yes, I can learn about history here, but I can learn from each of these leaders, 2 or 3 in each style, to help me bring out things that might help me, even though I might have a specific style. And yes, you have a tool in the back to help people get a sense, an assessment of where they fall. You want to say anything about that assessment at all, real quickly?
Yeah. So once you read the book, I identified that one of the things that a leader has to have, whatever other thing they have, is they need to have grit. They need to have, let's say, a willingness to succeed. In Billy Ocean's song, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. That is essentially grit. Now, you can wonder, okay, how do I stand on that? So what you find there is a measurement scale. At the end, you can fill it out for yourself. And based on the scores, I direct you, you can look at this or you can look at that. So depending on your very unique individual score. Also, what I have identified is that truly successful leaders, their lives, their careers are animated by an overarching vision. Let's say, call it a career goal. Now, that may evolve over time, or it can become more efficient, but more ambitious, sorry. But yes, a very clear career goal. Now, I also provide a measurement instrument there for you to assess where you stand on that aspect, and then how you can improve it, because some of the leaders that we start with don't have that. And when it comes to your personal leadership styles, whether you are more adaptive or perhaps more persuasive, or some combination, I provide an assessment instrument that again you can do on your own, just to assess where am I in these leadership styles. Am I comfortable with that? I help you there to decide that, and then what to do next. So what I do with these three tools, that helps the reader essentially, okay, say, where do I stand in that grand scheme of things, and how can I improve upon? And the funny thing is, that's just a side story, is that much of my academic work is actually in measurement analysis. That's highly mathematical, psychometric kind of stuff. Now, there's nothing of that in the book, but the skills that you find in the end of the book are based on that, a lot of knowledge that is being published in academic journals, etc., with a lot of difficult formulas, which are actually not so interesting here. But I use that knowledge to construct these scales.
To construct the scale, right? Exactly.
Yeah. But there's nothing like that of that stuff in the book. It is just only the scales are in the book, and not anything that is behind it or so.
Thankfully, we're happy for that, JB.
Yeah.
But what you now are telling us is it's good, it's solid, and it'll be helpful. And I think that people will find that that's true. So, the core of the book are the stories of these great leaders, some of whom we might be more familiar with because they are more recent than others. Some of whom you talked about during the stories about maybe they're a disruptive leader. He would probably say he was a servant leader. I'm thinking about St. Peter right now. And so, we're humans, and so we are leading humans, and we are humans, and we're innately complex. And so what you're trying to do is give us a framework to help us think about this. And that's what I think is especially valuable. It's interesting that you mentioned Franklin Roosevelt several times, and he's actually one of the stories that I really liked a lot. And so is there something specific that you would think would be useful maybe, or especially interesting to the audience about the FDR example that you think might be useful?
Well, I mean, there are a couple of elements into FDR. So one of the good things that FDR, impressive things, is that he was able to convince the American people, which in 1939, 1940 was overwhelmingly isolationist, wanted to have nothing to do with the war in Europe, for understandable reasons. Roosevelt didn't like war, but he knew that Hitler could not be stopped anywhere else. How Roosevelt, step by step, was able to take the American people with him towards greater involvement with Britain to fight the extreme power of Nazi Germany. Now, so I outlined that, and that is something about Roosevelt's ability to persuade the American population, and Roosevelt's ability to communicate directly with the Americans through, by the way, the internet. Radio is amazing. And what is also unique about, not unique about Roosevelt, but for us today important, is Roosevelt in his speeches always made it about us. He never made it about we versus them. Yeah, we versus them with Nazi Germany, but not when he talked to the American people, it was about us. Let us sit together when we think back about these dark days of the Depression. Let us now think what we could do. So the American people intuitively understand that together they are very powerful, but alone, each individual itself is not. And Roosevelt always made it about we together, you and I, all of us together. That is such a powerful lesson for us today. Another point that
Can I
Roosevelt.
just say something about that one before you go on?
Yeah,
When in working with leaders and coaching leaders, one of the things that I have come to just almost notice unconsciously is what pronouns they use, right? Do they speak in I and me, or do they speak in we and our? And I think, it connects to that point. And it says a lot, I think, about the mindset of that leader. I'm not necessarily passing judgment, but I am saying that it says something about what's going on behind their words and how it's going to impact the way in which they lead. And you describe brilliantly in the book about how that very point helps FDR move the sentiment of the country over about 2.5 years.
And that is amazing. If we just look at the current political discourse, where it is unfortunately a lot about we versus they, as opposed to, because we are currently in a big crisis. But let's face it, our crisis is nothing compared to the crisis that Roosevelt faced. The Great Depression, I mean, that was just so terrible. And then fighting Nazi Germany, they were so incredibly powerful. When I was at West Point, the people there admitted one thing very clearly. I said the German army in 1940 was probably the strongest the world had ever seen. Now, so the point here is, those were very clear challenges. And so Roosevelt had tremendous challenges, and he overcame them not by playing one against the other. And I believe that is sorely missing. And what Roosevelt was also doing is he was cool, measured, rational. So he was not given to hysterics, to drama. Most things is, and most Americans know it. He set the tone at his inaugural speech when he said, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." He understood that the people were very afraid. So let's face it, in a crisis, the people are afraid. Most people now are concerned. I mean, in America, in the world, people are concerned, jobs, COVID, a lot of other issues. So people are fearful. We need a leader that understands that fear and said, we are going to address that. So when you look at this inaugural speech, which I've watched a number of times, he has a command, he understands the fear, but he doesn't make the fear part of himself. He kind of says, okay, this is what you are fearful about, but that is the problem that we are fearful, but we are going to address it. So there is a reason why Roosevelt was such a great president. He was always in the lead. He was always in command. Roosevelt was not a guy, that people could walk over him. Absolutely not. But he made other people part of the process, although he was ultimately, the director of the club. That's very clear.
So we could have this conversation. He's grabbing something. We could have this conversation about every one of the stories in the book. There we go.
This is one of the biographies of Roosevelt, and this is what my father wrote in it. Now, that is in Dutch, and my father's handwriting was anyway not so great. He wrote a dedication to me when he was the president of the Netherlands Senate, so a major politician. And what did he say? And I will translate into English with an exclamation mark. Never forget what FDR has meant for the liberation of the Netherlands. Because he lived in Amsterdam at the time. This was not theory for him. He was living in Amsterdam under the Nazi regime. My mother was living, they were not married at the time, and she was eating tulip bulbs at the end. So for my father and my mother, FDR was not, he was a savior together with Churchill. So that's a personal side of FDR's relevance.
Right. So as I was saying, we could talk about every one of the leaders in the book and have that kind of an insightful conversation. If you found that insightful in just one of those stories, then you're definitely going to want to read a copy of A Time to Lead by Jan-Benedict Steenkamp. Before we go, JB, a couple other things I want to ask you, kind of leaving the book behind for just a minute. So when you're not teaching and learning about leadership and reading history and helping people be better marketers and brand leaders, what do you do for fun?
Well, I used to, for fun, to travel a lot to different countries. That would often be for work, but I love interacting with business people, learning from them. Now, so now my biggest fun is we have a gym here in our house. To work out in the gym. That is essentially everything that I can do, because there's nothing else going on here, unfortunately.
There you go. So he's working out in the house, but not while he's on the podcast. So
No.
We talked about reading. There's people that are watching see that there's books behind you. And the only question I told you I was going to ask you is, what are you reading these days? You obviously shown us a picture of the FDR book by Miller, but what are you reading these days?
Currently, I'm reading a fascinating biography of the life of Saint Catherine of Siena, which is a 14th century saint, a woman of very modest education, who by her lifestyle and, by the way, by her servant leadership, was able to speak directly to princes, to the Pope. And she is the first female doctor of the church. That is the highest honor that you can get as an authoritative person when it comes to the thinking. So I find her life to be very fascinating. That's what I'm reading right now.
Beautiful. So back to your book and the book that you want all of us to be reading. Where can people learn more about you and your work and get a hold of the book?
Well, the book you can easily get at about any bookstore, but when we think about Amazon or Barnes and Nobles, but Amazon is the biggest player, just go to Amazon and type in my name, and it will pop up. You can purchase it in an e-reader or in a hard copy. The e-version is considerably cheaper, but some people like me actually still like the hard copy. And
me too.
Yeah. And as you see behind there, yes, I have some more hard copies around.
Absolutely.
You can connect with me on LinkedIn. Just send me an invitation. I regularly post things there that you might find interesting, and you may have things to share that I can also learn from. And you can go to my website. As the third one is simple, www.jbsteenkamp.com. There you can, for example, do a quiz one of the scales that are in the book is also online available. So that's a third resource that you can just check out.
jbsteenkamp.com. That's with Steenkamp with a K, everybody. You can see it if you're watching. Yeah. So before we go, I have a question for all of you that are watching and listening. It's a very important question. And the question is, now what? What are you going to do as a result? Well, obviously, there's two of us here that hope you buy a copy of the book. But beyond that, what is it that you're going to do with what you learned today? Maybe you want to spend some more time thinking about these 7 styles and where you might fit. Maybe you realize that you need to think about your role as a leader a little differently. Maybe you need to reconsider how you develop your leadership style over time. Whatever it is that you take from this session, do something. Just listening or watching is not really enough. And so, JB, thank you for being here. It was a pleasure to have you.
It was an honor, and thank you so much for your questions and spending the time with me.
It was a pleasure. So everybody, before we go, you know that we're here live today. Many of you are watching this or listening to this later on the podcast. We're going to do more of these live in the future, and the best way to make sure you know about that ahead so you can get a jump start is to join us either on the Facebook group or the LinkedIn group. That's remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn. remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook to get access to those things. We'll hope you'll join us there. Either way, we'll be back here next week for another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you.